Welcome back to another episode of Remotely Speaking Up. And I'm very honored this week to have joining with us Mr. Jon Younger. Now, Jon is a person that writes continuously in Forbes about the freelance revolution. He is an author, he's a consultant, he does so much in this space. And one of the great things as well is that, Jon, you were the first person to really inspired me really when I was starting to pursue this area of research. I remember your article in Harvard Business Review on the atypical workforce. So it's absolutely my pleasure to be talking.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you so much. This really means a lot. So today, Jon is really going to be telling us more about, well, you know, we're continuing that conversation about the future of work. And one of the big changes or upsets that we've been seeing is that they're increasing freelancers. A lot of people as well are choosing to leave their full-time roles and go to freelancing. And Jon, you're very much ahead of the game in writing about this. So can you tell us a bit about what really got you on to focusing on this trend?
Sure. I'll give you a little bit of autobiography, and then I'll start to talk about some of those trends.
Sure.
I got interested in this in 2012, 2013. I'm an old guy, so I'm going to give you some context that's older than last week. And back in 2012, 2013, I was doing a strategy project. I was part of a consultancy called the RBL Group. People who are in HR will know some of us. Dave Ulrich, Norm Smallwood, Jon Younger were the principals of the firm. And one of our projects was a sort of a human capital strategy for McKesson, the very large global pharmaceutical company. And the head of HR was also the head of marketing. The CEO was there, and some other folks were in the room when we were talking about the results. And they said, "What have you found that would surprise you?" And I said, well, I'm not sure whether it's a surprise or I'm just sort of disconcerted, but 30% of your workforce is contingent. You don't know about them, and apparently you don't care about them. Yeah. And that sounds crazy. And they were astounded. And their immediate reaction was, what do you mean 30%? If you sort of think about the freelance revolution, which is not just tech, but there's a lot of tech in it. Historically, what's happened is that freelancers have been hired at the project manager or at the business unit level, almost never at the corporate level, unless they're hiring for corporate stuff. And so the erosion of the traditional workforce, the traditional employment workforce, has been gradual, and it's been happening over a long time. And lots of organizations just didn't kind of realize that it was happening in plain sight because it wasn't stuff that came to them. Mm-hmm. So now let's sort of go forward a few years, and you know, freelancing kind of started more or less forever, right? I mean, the architects and the engineers of Rome in the first century AD were freelancers. They were independent professionals that had decided to not be full-time employees. So we've had lots and lots and lots of those folks over time, but we didn't have the Industrial Revolution, which had sort of made the case that in order to grow, employees needed to be next to the place where they worked, right? And so you'd build these towns around the factories, et cetera. Well, technology's kind of blown that up in the last few years. I mean, I'm doing work right now, and I'm here in New York, and you're outside of a major city in London by your university, and we're still working. So no longer are people tethered to their location. That's created tremendous opportunities for all kinds of people. You know what else it's done, Rochelle? It's leveled the playing field. Absolutely. You know, I mean, it's a wonderful thing that somebody in Pakistan has a shot at the same job I've got a shot at. And you know, maybe he or she has better credentials. But what they didn't have until very recently was the opportunity to do that. Mm-hmm. So the technology has been a big change, and it's opened the aperture for all kinds of freelancing There's some freelancing that you can't do over a computer. You can't be an airline pilot. Singapore Air hires lots of freelance airline pilots. You can't do that on your Mac, but you can do an awful lot of stuff on your Mac.
Yeah.
And what's happened over time is that capability got married to the recognition through the pandemic that people had been unhappy for a long time.
Yeah.
And so what we've seen is it's been called the Great Resignation. Honest to goodness, it's not the Great Resignation. It's the Great Awakening. I mean, people just got here, I mean, and when you ask them, why did you leave? What they said, if you take a look, there's a wonderful article by Steve King at Emergent Research that was published in the Harvard Business Review in the last week. And it's because people have felt alienated from their organization, alienated from their boss. It doesn't seem that they know what they're doing. They fired 11 million people within 2 months without even thinking about it. You have the experience of people reading about companies like Better, the mortgage company where the guy fired 9,000 people through Zoom. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's causing people to say, do I really want to put that time and effort and my life into that? And by the way, in addition to the work and the discretionary work that follows from that I do at night, do I really want to drive an hour and a half each way to get there? So all of these things kind of got together. And what we've seen is that people have been making choices, that they've said, I don't want to feel alienated. I don't want to feel as though I don't trust my organization. And at the same time, and I know I'm blathering on, but it's...
No, you go ahead.
It's okay? Can I keep going just a little bit?
Please. It's so relevant.
So here's what happened that people don't quite realize. That at the same time as the COVID stuff was hitting, and I'm just going to talk about the US, but it's really a global phenomenon. It's certainly UK, Europe, Western Eastern Europe, and North America. What happened is we started to realize that people were learning how to be entrepreneurial, learning how to be freelancers at the same time, and that came together. So if you take a look at the US, there are 60 million freelancers, more or less. Of the 60 million, which is about 35% of the total workforce, but it's a funny thing because 45 million of the 60 million are part-timers. They're people like you, Rochelle, who run this wonderful podcast and do some consulting. At the same time, you're a full-time prof.
Yeah.
Right? So now think about that for a minute. I mean, it's one thing to be a prof with a PhD and your background and your credentials and all that stuff. And that's a heck of a leg up. But for an awful lot of the 45 million people, what we discovered was that they were learning how to be confident. They were learning how to be self-reliant. They were learning how to have the faith that they could make their own way because they were making some money and learning how to run a business. So it has opened up their lives to a different set of opportunities. Once the stuff that they'd been doing as side giggers to make a little extra money to pay for presents for Christmas or whatever the heck it was, all of a sudden that got connected to events in the world, and they discovered that they didn't need to stay in the company that they didn't want to be at. They discovered that they could make a change to another company, or they discovered that maybe they could do it on their own. And that's the real story of the pandemic's role in the freelance revolution. And then there's more, but I'm going to take a deep breath and a little bit to drink.
No worries. No, you're absolutely right. I like just listening to you talk about it. It just reminds me of that combination. It's almost like where purpose meets passion and meets opportunity. Before the pandemic, we weren't awake, as you said, to the opportunities that were available to us on a global scale. And then also
we didn't have them because we didn't have the technology, right?
That's true.
So part of this is technology has democratized the potential, not the reality, but the potential.
Yeah, that's an excellent word for it. And
Yeah.
you're very much right. I think now with people realizing they don't have to put up with organizational politics, they don't have to put up with an unhealthy work environment, that there are actually options and they're capable, as you said, because of the technology, through whether that's starting out just from a simple e-learning course and building a skill and then building your business from there. It's really forced people, the pandemic has really forced people in a good way to kind of
Yeah.
consider, well, what are the alternatives? But we know now that that has a real knock-on effect on businesses as well.
Yes.
So what do you think from an organizational perspective needs to happen now?
Now that gets interesting. So there's a dilemma. You would think that, well, just a few years ago, Accenture wrote this piece in its blog that made the case that there would soon be a Fortune 500 company that only had full-time employees in the C-suite. Everybody else would be contingent, contract, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we have examples of that historically. So an example of that is making a movie.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you think about, Batman Begins or whatever as an example. They brought together thousands of people and $200 million in investment, and they created an organization that lasted for about 9 months and a product that's continued to exist, but the organization no longer does. And so we know how to do that stuff. I mean, we do it with music, we do it with art, we do it with, I mean, we know how to do that stuff. But for freelancing to really sort of get to escape velocity, if I can use that term, we have a mismatch in supply and demand. Here's what I mean. While we have 60 million folks in the US, as an example, that are freelancers, remember 45 million of those are part-timers. Well, if you're a big company, if you're a company like Procter & Gamble or Unilever or one of those, you want to hire freelancers to help you because you know you need some help in certain areas.
Yeah.
But it's really a pain in the neck to hire part-timers because they have conflicts. They may have a conflict with the nature of their employment. They may have a conflict in terms of their schedule. They have a conflict to any number of things. And so you really need full-time freelancers to get to escape velocity in organizations. And we don't have enough of them. We don't have enough of them. So we are limited in our ability to fundamentally change organizational life by the mix of part-time and full-time freelancers that we've got. So we've got a big job in helping more people feel confident that they can do this. Now, the reason I say confident is the data says that once people do go full-time, if they have skills, I mean, if they thought it through, if they've got a plan and, doing the same thing every business needs to do, that the chances are very, very good that they'll make as much or more money and have more flexibility and have more time and have more choice and have more agency. So, part of the challenge is how you get people over that hump so that you can reach escape velocity, so that you can start to really impact the way in which organizations work. But it's going to take a while for us to get there. And so, as an example, so one of the things that I know you do is you help people to figure out if they can be successful freelancers. You help to give them some of the skills that they need as they become successful freelancers. But as much as anything, you help them go through the thought process and the planning process in your consulting and coaching work to help people figure that stuff out. We need to figure out how to do that at scale.
Yeah.
What you're doing is great, but it's a great but. It's I need 1 million of you. and I know there's only one Dr. Rochelle Haynes, so I'm sort of screwed unless I can find a way to build it at scale. And I'll give you one specific example before I let you talk about this. I spoke to a wonderful lady who runs a platform in France, Kilbrary, I think it is. She is a Caroline Arub. I forgot her last name, but Caroline. She's lovely, and she runs a consultancy in France that serves the Middle East. She is Syrian by background, and she left Syria around 2005 when many people did. And she said, can you help me? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, I have a contract to train 1,000 Jordanians to be successful freelancers, and it's a big job. And I said, well, you ought to talk to, in this case, I said, you ought to talk to Albert, as is Clausen, because he does that. I don't do that. And then connected the two of them. And you and I both know Albert.
He's amazing.
And he is. But, that's what I mean, at scale. We've got to figure out not how to help an individual. We've got to help to figure out a generation. and that takes some work. But now, where does that get you to? What it gets you to is a fundamentally different way of thinking about organizations that we can talk about in a minute.
And I think even in that role, I think the organizations have such a fundamental part to play in achieving that in scale. But what I've found constantly is that companies treat individuals and employees who show entrepreneurial skills or have a side hustle or whatever the case as threats or conflicts. They see them as almost employees, and employees, you're supposed to work for this firm within this box, do as we tell you, follow your job description and your role. And if this person shows that actually, no, I want to innovate and I can go beyond this, and this will also create leverage for the company. It also builds the company's reputation and brand. But I find a lot of companies push back against employees who express that, let's say, ability or willingness to want to consult or whatever the case. So I think, yes, on one hand, we do need to address it on scale so individuals can actually achieve that. But on the other hand, I think the organizations need to change their mindset around that as well, because it shouldn't be seen as individuals who want, even if your employee wants to work towards being a freelancer and working for you as a freelancer, organizations should be open to that rather than shutting it down.
I absolutely buy it. And one of the things that might help, and it would be interesting if one of your clients were to undertake this. I don't know if they would. Gazprom, large energy company. And right now, people are very happy for obvious reasons. It's pretty terrible what's going on in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
But I will tell you that there are smart things happening in Gazprom, despite all the awfulness. And one of the things that I thought was super smart, Nikolai Dolgov is a friend of mine who runs the freelance activities in Gazprom. There are 38,000 technical people on his platform that he seeks help from on a regular basis. So, like many companies, he's interested in that direct sourcing model, creating a platform that extends his workforce into freelancing. But he does something beyond that, which I think is really impressive, and Nikolai gets a lot of credit for it. He's convinced Gazprom to let their employees do side gigs, to do side hustles.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you want to open up an organization, we've got to start by opening up some minds. And the best way to open up minds is to have them do what you hope everybody does. So I'm excited about that. Now here's, and there are other organizations that are starting to do that stuff as well, just not without as much experience as Gazprom. There are two things that I would say to you about it, and you're absolutely right. Our models are industrial and ultimately they're colonial, and we've got to get past that crap. I mean, the organization change stuff is interesting. In our survey, so we did this global survey of freelancers, and we got freelancers from 70 platforms or 75 platforms in about 30 countries to participate. And one of the questions that we asked was we asked a series of questions that sort of gave us feedback on what they thought about their clients. And one of the questions was, this client knows how to work well with freelancers. Well, the average was about 45%. In other words, 55% of people weren't sure or were quite sure that they didn't know how to work well with freelancers. So what is it that they need to do? And it turns out that the companies that do a good job working with freelancers do 6 things right. And they're not the hardest things in the world. And if somebody goes to Jon Younger Forbes 6 factors for organizations, they'll read the article that describes it. But there were 6 things. First is, can I go through them? Would that be helpful?
Of course. I'm excited.
One, the company needs to have an informed and thoughtful point of view about when to use freelancers. So, for some companies, it's only on demand, only when they don't absolutely have to. In other companies, it's supplementing critical capabilities. It's Apple saying, we're going to have a core group of designers, and then we're going to hire a lot of design firms around that. Or in some cases, it's organizations that say, we're going to move away from the notion of full-time employees for the most part, and stock with more, at least a mix of freelancers and full-time employees. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, but whatever it is, talk about it. Get clear about it. Figure it out. It's a reality here. HR ought to be leading these conversations, not leaving this stuff to procurement. And at the end of the day, what you want to do is you want to have a point of view about a workforce that is able to be productive on the one hand, but also change ready and agile. So it's really important that they have a clear view, because if they don't have a clear view, everybody gets confused. Managers don't know when to hire and when to not. Directors don't know when to support, when to not. It just gets all messy. So the first thing is organizations need to have a point of view, a philosophy, a strategy, whatever you want to call it, and that they need to communicate that. Second, and by the way, the reason they need to communicate that is because employees want to know. And if employees aren't told, they're going to think the worst, because remember, we don't have much faith in our organizations these days. Second, freelancers need to work in an organization where they have a rigorous process of performance review, planning, and feedback. I want a clear SOW because I don't want to waste my time. I want to know the milestones. I want to know the schedule. I want to be able to comment back, this is realistic or this is nuts. And I want absolutely the feedback on a regular basis on how I'm doing. What I don't want to find out is that nothing's been told to me and then all of a sudden I'm way behind. That's just not fair. So I need feedback. And I need feedback, Rochelle, because at the end of the day, that's the only thing I've got to go to my next customer, right? I got to show you that I'm worth whatever. Third, very important that managers know how to work with freelancers, because managers tend to think that people that work for them, they own them, and they don't own freelancers. You don't own me as a freelancer any more than the guy in the bodega is owned by the guy that buys a bottle of water. It's an identical transaction. I sell you my time and my expertise in exchange for a reasonable rate of pay and a good experience. That's all you get, man. That is it. But you need to know how to work with me. And you need to know how to give me feedback that's helpful, but helpful as a colleague, not as a subordinate. Fourth, and I can see that number 3 really you like that one.
Definitely. It's a bit of an identity crisis sometimes the organization faces with whether to consider this person as an employee or if to consider them as a client or a company. So you're hitting the nail on the head there.
Yeah. Number 4 is, for the time that I'm working on a project, which is typically what happens for most freelancers, because that's different than sort of regular part-time work. If you're a regular part-time employee, then you're a regular part-time employee. freelancers are typically brought in to get something specific done as opposed to sort of manage a process or something like that. And so the number 4 thing is, for the time that I'm part of the team, treat me as part of the team. Simple. But don't give me a different color badge. You know, I mean, don't tell me I can't go to that meeting which everybody else in the team is going to. Don't tell me I can't eat in that cafeteria. I've got to go to another cafeteria. Come on, you guys. Number 5 is be clear about some of the things that freelancers can't do or they shouldn't do. I'm on a project right now with a group where I'm teaching them about the freelancing world, and they wanted some help in thinking about how they were going to organize this little segment team in line with, and my reaction was, I can't help you with that. And they said, why? And I said, because I can tell you how segment organizations are created and what makes them work, et cetera, but I can't tell you what it is in your place. And your place has a history, and you have an implicit philosophy of organization design. You're a big bank, and you know, asking me to give you my best guess, which has no context, is dumb. So I'm not going to do that. So, you know, there's some areas where I just don't have the relationships, or I don't have the knowledge, or I don't have the history, or I don't have I don't have the credibility. I was asked to do a piece of work a long time ago as a consultant to a company, and at the end of the day, the president said to the head of HR, I don't think he understands us. You know what? He was right. He was absolutely right. I did not understand how this place worked. And I had no business consulting to it if I couldn't get it. It's number 5. Number 6 is, and this is the one everybody remembers, certainly in the UK, where Liz Barkley, the Commissioner of Small Business, is knocking down the doors to get people paid on time. And by the way, you should have Liz Barkley on your show. She's great.
I hope she's listening.
And well, if she's not, Albert can help you. And number 6 is treat them with respect and pay them on time. I had, the data seems to be that people are getting better about it, but there's still silliness. And I'll give you an example of how our own industry reacts. One of the really big platforms started to try to get me to work with them, try to write for them. And they were saying this, and they were saying that, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and this is so exciting, blah, blah, blah. And I said, so let's talk about compensation. And they said, well, no, there's no compensation. We thought that the exposure would be worthwhile. And I went, you know, you're a freelance platform. You know better than that. I mean, that's the same crap answer that you give whenever you want to take advantage of somebody. Come on, you guys, don't do that.
That gets
and they were a little embarrassed, but you know, I mean, but that still happens, right? And so you want to make sure people get paid fairly, and you want to make sure that they get paid on time. So those are the 6.
Yeah.
It's really easy 6. I mean, it's not hard to do this. It just takes focus and effort. And what we know from our data is, as I said, 45% of our freelancers say 45% overall of their clients seem to get it, and 55% seem to get less or not at all.
And 55%, that's too big a number. I mean,
well, 25% is too big a number. It's huge. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it still comes from the mindset. As you said, it's the mindset is still very colonial. It's still very industrial. This idea of they work for us, or the other problem is that they're not even seen as really working for them. They're seen as casual and disposable and treated as such. I've heard a lot of the things you said with regards to like one of the things our research showed was the same thing in terms of people not being paid on time, are taking work from freelancers and then just disappearing. They just disappear from the website. They never hear from them again. And you typically wouldn't do that to an employee because you know that there'll be consequences.
Right. Now, here's the really interesting thing about all of this, and that is it sort of shows how difficult it is to change historical points of view. We still hear from people, well, I don't think I want to use freelancers because, if they were really good, they'd have a job. Or I don't want to work with freelancers because, they're just not as loyal. I mean, they don't really care about me. They're like carpetbaggers in the US, right? To which my response is, are you insane? Are you not looking at reality? Are you not noticing that Gen Zs and millennials are starting to look at new jobs after 6 months? Are you not noticing that people stay less than 2 years on average, at the same time as our data says it takes about 2 years before we break even on an employee? That is to say, investing in the time, investing in the training, et cetera, versus their productivity. So the message I think that we've got to get across is some of these are just sort of old shibboleths that just don't make sense anymore. We're holding on to a period in time that for old guys like me, I mean, there are lots of regrets. But I mean, one of the things that I was talking to a young person recently, and it's somebody in their early 30s, and I said, well, how do you feel about remote? And they said, well, we wouldn't do it any other way. And I said, so aren't you worried about, not making the contacts you're making, building the networks so that you can progress in the organization? He said, that's just not what I'm thinking about. What I'm doing is looking for where the really smart people are going and where the interesting work is. And if it's not in my current organization, I'm going to go somewhere else. Because what drives me is smart people and interesting projects, not progression up a hierarchy. It's really important that organization leaders hear this, because it's a different understanding of career than the one I grew up with and my dad grew up with. And it's starkly different, and it's easy for people to dismiss it as youthful. I don't think it's youthful. I think it's just the way things are.
It's a shift. It's a complete shift, and organizations, as you said, are still dismissing it, and then they're still questioning or surprised at their high turnover rates, and they're blaming their high turnover rates on, as you said, lack of loyalty and whatnot. But what they should be doing is, if they realize that it's a shift in mentality, then prepare your organization for that. Rethink the career path that you're trying to set individuals on. If it is that that they're going to be there for just 2 years, decide what type of relationship you're going to have with that employee. How are you going to use these skills, and how are you going to train them in a way that both them and the company benefits? Yes,
I think that's a wonderful point. And it's really, really hard. It's really, forget about the word hard. It's really important that we rethink some of these fundamentals. I agree 100%. And of course, where does it lead? Well, it leads in all sorts of directions. I mean, it leads in the direction of working on, education, right? One of the things that I wrote this article a while ago that said, I think entrepreneurship is great. Have we any schools of solopreneurship? Are we educating people around what it takes to be a great freelancer, which is not necessarily the same thing that it takes to build a large organization as an entrepreneur? And it turns out that there are some really cool programs out there, but it's hard to hear about them. They tend to be local. They tend to be here in the States, community colleges, technical schools. In the UK, they tend to be at public libraries. They tend to, just really interesting stuff that we're really seeing in so many ways. Enough stuff getting together around the ecosystem of this that we will hit that tipping point that I believe will change both organizations and lead to scale around freelancing. And I'll give you one small example, which is we're doing a project for another bank where we put together a bunch of platforms and asked the question, let's create a study group essentially, which is what are the future financial services needs of freelancers. And I know you guys are dealing with a new set of laws that are sort of funky around freelancing. Here in the States, we've got to solve a bunch of problems around, sort of banking. So for example, it's harder to get a mortgage if you're a freelancer. Hard to borrow money for equipment, even if you need the equipment to do your work. And the craziness is that we just haven't figured out the right categories. So for example, for this one bank that we were talking with, they said, well, it's really hard for us to sort of work the algorithms for freelancers. And I said, harder than a veterinarian? Harder than a photographer? Harder than a lawyer? Harder than a doctor? Harder than an accountant? I mean, come on, you guys, you're just telling me you're lazy. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, do a count. How many people do you have who are freelancing currently, who are members of, who are a customer of your bank? And they did so, and they found out that there were hundreds of thousands of freelancers. They just hadn't called them that. So they had a category called vet, or a category called, pediatrician. They just needed to create a category called freelancer, and the algorithm could get worked out because they sure had enough data. They just hadn't figured it out yet. So we're getting there. It just, it takes some time.
Yeah, and it will continue to take some time. Well, Jon, you've given us so much to think about. Thank you.
Oh my God.
I love all of the examples that you've included as well. So thank you for joining us on this episode of Remotely Speaking Up. And for our audiences, tell them before we go, what is the funniest remote work experience that you've had today?
I dare not stand up right now, or you'll find out for real. But I wear large, bright boxers, and I'm not showing you.
Thank God. I'm sure they're wonderful, but we don't need to see them. We'll keep it PG-13. Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
For our audiences, if you want to know more about how you can bring freelancers on board, be sure to check out Jon's writings, Jon's articles. In Forbes, Jon contributes a lot of articles on freelance revolutions and also key technologies that helps to enhance that working relationship as well. And if you or your clients are struggling in any way on how to work with freelancers, or you yourself want to become a freelancer, be sure to go to www.crowdpotential.co.uk to find out more information, or just connect with myself or Jon on LinkedIn as well.
So, Rochelle, Dr. Rochelle.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode. And Jon, again, thank you. It's been a pleasure. So take care for now, our audience, and take care, Jon. Thank you.